Okay, back again. Um, just completed one video today and wanted to make another one. Throughout the videos of the channel so far, we've got a strange melange of esoteric, literary, and kind of reflections on technology and conspiracy and stuff. And I wanted to add a new chapter to some of those investigations. And I've used the word literature over and over throughout the videos that I've made so far. And this video is to really present a great qualification on that word literature. And I'm going to begin talking about the actor, writer on film, and dramatist and metaphysician who is known as the French writer Antonin Artaud. Was prominent in the Surrealist movement, and he was an actor in the beginnings of film in the 20s. Probably his most popular role was the Jeanne d'Arc movie from the 20s. I think there's been a few remakes of it since then. I remember I lived in Japan around the turn of the century, and that was one of my first access points into Artaud as an actor. Previous to that, I'd read a book called Selected Writings of Antonin Artaud, introduced by Susan Sontag, the American intellectual, who I've come to be very skeptical about, and I would, if you grab hold of that book, which is probably the main book in English, published by a US publisher, that will give you a real rounded introduction to Antonin Artaud. And I'll probably deal with Artaud, probably pronouncing his name wrong. I'll give you a proper introduction to his writings in another video possibly, but I'm only mentioning him now because I want to talk about what this word Bardism is. And I think he's in my little personal pantheon of bards. Now, what do I mean by that word? We all know the word bard in British culture. We know it primarily through the Bard, William Shakespeare. But the reason I mention Artaud in this context is his contempt for literature. And that needs a little bit of unpacking. Artaud was also a big fan of, well, if you read his writings on theatre, he is coming from the position that the tradition of text in Western culture is an aberrant tradition. Possibly there are different meanings, different signifiers that you can take from that. Possibly he's meaning that the Irish tradition is closer to the real tradition, which is memorized work, songs that are memorized and passed down through the centuries. And I'm a big fan of folk music, so that's something I'm fairly aware of. I don't take the extreme position that Artaud takes on that issue. I think that there's an importance to text. I think the best poetry usually combines the visible text with the singable voice or the metrical voice, the voice in rhythm to some form of song. And even if it's being composed without music in mind, it will have a musical aspect to it. Probably the best example would be the poems of Dylan Thomas, who I've mentioned in other videos. Now, why do I mention Shakespeare in the word bard in connection to this? Well, I think the word bard has a much older history than the word writer. I think the writer is quite limiting, and I think bard is a better expression. Of course, literature comes out of writing, so for me it's only part of the game of being a creative poet, and that's probably the reason why I mentioned Artaud in this kind of preamble. Like I say, I won't touch too much on Artaud. He does have a connection with Ireland. Apparently, he was arrested in Ireland after a short visit towards the end of the 30s, and there's actually a book been published called 1937 Apocalypse, which is Artaud's letters from Ireland, and they're mostly addressed to André Breton, the leader of the Surrealist movement. I'm not a big fan of conventional surrealism, particularly the politics of surrealism, as I've said before. But he's a good place to start, Artaud, because he is extreme in his views of the way that culture gets passed down through the centuries, and as I say, he's disregarding of the text as the main form. But he's really only part of this little thesis that I want to present. That's called Bardism. I think Bardism is more of a corollary to Shamanism. Up until the 17th, even into the 18th centuries, we had a tradition, particularly in the Western Isles of Britain, Ireland, modern Ireland, Scotland, Wales in particular. If you take the Celtic aspect of the British Isles, and that problem, Celt, I'm going to get into in another video, because it is a problematic term, and it's only a very modern term actually if you look into it. But it does mean that the racial origins of the people of these isles concerns itself with the shamanic to one degree or another. And the bardic is probably somewhere between the shamanic and the man of letters, the person who is the writer in the modern sensibility. And this, I would assume, is why we call Shakespeare the bard, because it signifies something that is visionary and is shamanic, possibly, without being entirely literary and cultural, although it gets absorbed into the literary and the cultural sphere. So I just want to get into that today. What is this Bardism? Where does it come from? At least to get at it in vague terms as an introduction today, and then you can do with it what you will. I've already spoken in the last video on conspiracy, this sense of the spiritual realm and the supernatural realm, and I think this is important in the sense of Bardism. Visionary experiences, like those of William Blake, usually come with some kind of spiritual informancy. So as we were losing, say for example in Ireland and Wales and parts of England and Scotland, this idea of the shamanic or the folkloric, the fairy lore, we were getting certain resurrections of things. So for example, Yeats's Celtic Twilight period at the end of the 19th century definitely kind of plugs into this kind of shamanic bardic tradition that existed and has always existed, I would imagine, for thousands of years in the British Isles. And it's obviously not contained to the British Isles. We have global shamanism, we have shamanism in nearly every part of the world. We have traditions that have been discussed by people like Mircea Eliade, a great source for people like Terence McKenna. And so I just want to give you some examples of what I might call Bardism in its kind of original form. Now, it's a tricky topic because the other thing is that Bardism's fruition is literature. It seems to me that shamanism and Bardism, or the bards, the line of bards, are the root of literature. So I wouldn't be as extreme as Artaud in saying that all literature is shit, I think he says, or something to that effect. And he's not alone. There are other, I think there have been other writers who just will not have anything to do with text. And of course it's ironic because Artaud's collected works are obviously printed and they're becoming more and more available. The other thing, just before I get off the topic of Artaud, he's a very misunderstood figure. He seems to have been absorbed into deconstructionism at some point, and ultimately transhumanism, dangerously so. And now, I'm not an expert on the untranslated areas of Artaud. All of his writings are available in French, and they go to many, many, many volumes, like in the 20s of volumes of writing. Only the more popular elements of his writing, say on theatre, have been really translated and circulated in the West more generally. But it seems to me Bardism and Shamanism are the root, so that if you are a practicing poet and you are writing in the 21st century, you kind of owe it to yourself to understand what that bardic line might be. And as I say, I'm only going to put it forward in vague terms in the video. What are its connections with mythology? What are its connections to the mythic in the ancient world? And what could be the mythic as we go through the centuries up until today. Take, for example, somebody like Dylan Thomas. I would say that is visionary poetry. It is not commentary. And this comes out of a philosophy, I think, which is somebody like Bishop Berkeley, Yeats's great philosopher type that he loved, was that everything is coming from within into the outer world. What I would say commentary and journalism is comparison between different physical phenomena and existent phenomena in the material world. Bardism is more inherently dealing with, I would say this is the original disposition of the Celt, or of the pre-Celtic even, of the people who inhabited these isles, which is the visionary experience is primary, all commentary is secondary in order to learn, absolutely, that's why we're in the material world, but that's not the root of where all writing comes from and all knowledge comes from. That comes from within, just as St. John in the Bible can say, God is within. The kingdom of heaven, etc. I don't have a lot of text to bolster my argument here because my library is split up between locations. I'm going to suggest a few texts that might relate to what I'm talking about. They're not specifically literary texts, obviously, because of this problem of literature being the outcome of this root, of this, you could say, racial line, or the spiritual disposition of the people of this area of the world and all over the world. It seems to me that somebody like Shakespeare is a form of magician, and Ted Hughes has talked about the relationship between magic and poetry. So it's not like I'm really originating this concept. But I'm just going to show you a few texts that I've used and I approach, and I think are necessary to an understanding of what the bardic line might be. I still have to kind of augment my reading with new bits of information about what that bardic line would be in a seamless way. I don't think that would be entirely possible, because you'd have to kind of do a historical study as well as a kind of philosophical study of what it actually entails. But a lot of commentary on poetry, not enough, but we have enough to get our hands on now. so that we can see the connection between Western esotericism and poetry and philosophy as well. All of these things are intertwined. But I'm going to show you a book. I think in the last video I explained that when I was living in Korea, I got a hold of a bunch of PDFs. I download quite a lot of PDFs, and at that time I was fortunate enough to make books, and I showed this on camera in the last video, but I'm going to use it in this video. It's called the Barddas of Iolo Morganwg, and it's a Welsh book, and it's dealing with mainly philosophy, but I would categorize it as the old traditions of Bardism, which would be the Ogham script out of Ireland and other areas of Britain. Philosophy, theology, these are all more sanctioned terms for what Bardism is. Theology is an outcrop of Bardism, I would suggest. Philosophy possibly also. Shamanism goes back to ancient Greece, I would say. People like Parmenides and Empedocles have been characterized as philosophers. I would say they're not, they're shamans, and that philosophy is a kind of, the later period of Greece applied philosophia, the love of wisdom, and they applied that naming to their earlier tradition, which was actually much more shamanic, but they only had that term to cover it. So in general academic terms, you would just have philosophy covering that idea. I don't believe that's true. I think shamanism and Bardism, even for that period of ancient Greece, existed and still exist. We have a tradition of, at least in Ireland and Scotland, the tradition of storytellers, people who know the myths and keep them in good working order and add to them and do all sorts of stuff to keep the stories vibrant and up to date. That's a mythological angle as well. There's loads of stuff involved with this. I've already mentioned Roberto Colasso, who I will probably do a video on, just as a myth. He calls himself a mythographer. He's definitely in that tradition. So Bardism, it's a specific term, but it covers different disciplines, and it's all to do with the way that languages have developed over time and the way that subjects have been categorized. If I can shed any light on that definition in later videos, I'll do that, because I think it's kind of important. Alright, this book, it has a shady history. It's, as with lots of books of true wisdom, in my mind, it has a contentious publishing history. A lot of people are not convinced that it's a genuine work of philosophy. It was not brought forward by, it's a complicated publishing situation. I think from what I remember, John Williams is the name of the author, but he's given himself a bardic name. Usually the bardic names are given in the original languages of these isles, so that would be Welsh, Middle English possibly, Scots. It would be going back into those languages. I'll just read the introduction. He's a very contentious figure, John Williams. He produces this book of ancient knowledge, and he gives locations about, he says where he's got the knowledge from, but it's still quite vague, and a lot of people have said it's not a genuine work of philosophy and that he's created it all. It's a little bit like, if anybody knows Thomas Chatterton, one of the early romantic poets who was inspired a lot of romantic poets. He publishes these poems by Rowley, a priest. I think he's called, I can't remember the first name of that person that he invents, but essentially Thomas Chatterton invents a name for this priest who writes these poems in order for him to access another epoch and write poetry as if it came out of another epoch. It's not an isolated situation. I'll remember the other examples of that and try to put them in the description. There's quite a few of them anyway. Okay. I'm going to get all of the pronunciations wrong. I'm not an expert of Celtic languages, so I'm trying my best to remedy that, but I want to be in a location to be able to do it. I'm going to do some stuff on the internet. Anyway, with fumbling pronunciations, let's go through the preface. The Barddas of Iolo Morganwg is a collection of writings largely forged. This is the contentious issue about ancient Welsh Bardic and Druidic beliefs. Although the author of this work is cited as J. Williams Ab Ithel, he was actually the editor who pieced it together from manuscripts written by Iolo Morganwg. Iolo Morganwg, 1747 to 1826. Sorry, there was a real poet. I got it wrong. Itinerant poet and scholar, was a key figure in the Druid revival of the 19th century. He was personally responsible for reviving the Welsh national poetry contest, the Gorsedd, on June 21st, 1792, midsummer evening. Iolo and a dozen other Welsh poets gathered on Primrose Hill in London and held the first Gorsedd in hundreds of years. Iolo was a Welsh patriot and held revolutionary views. He was a personal friend of Tom Paine and George Washington, and George Washington subscribed to his first volume of poetry. He is said to have influenced both William Blake's poetry and Robert Graves's White Goddess. He revived the concept that the Welsh explorer Madoc discovered America. This led to an expedition to Mandan territory in the Great Plains, which found no trace of the Welsh, but was one of the inspirations for Thomas Jefferson's Lewis and Clark expedition. Iolo Morganwg's contributions to world culture are still with us today. There is an extensive neo-Druid movement, and the Gorsedd and Welsh nationalism are still going strong. The Gorsedd is held annually during the Eisteddfod in Wales, a festival of Welsh culture. Two other Celtic regions, Cornwall and Brittany, have also adopted the Gorsedd. Iolo Morganwg, born Edward Williams, a native speaker of both English and Welsh, spent his entire life collecting and transcribing medieval Welsh documents, as well as writing poetry under his own byline. He was also a first-rate literary forger of ancient Welsh. Some have commented that his forgeries were as good or better than the real thing. Furthermore, he wrote much of the Barddas under the influence of laudanum, an opium-based medication which he took for asthma. Scholars have spent 2 centuries trying to establish which parts of his extensive writings, purporting to be based on ancient manuscripts, are genuine, and which he wrote personally. Our understanding is still very murky. For these reasons, Iolo's writings are considered highly controversial. Okay, so I got it wrong. I was thinking of another writer which I'll put in the description. So yes, it's written. It's brought down to us through John Williams, and this was a writer who was around at the time of William Blake. Because Druidic beliefs were exclusively transmitted orally, we have no primary accounts of it, so there is practically nothing to compare this text with. What we do know is summarised neatly in the preface to this work, and consists of a few excerpts from classical authors. The longest account is from Julius Caesar, who was more interested in exterminating Druids, so he was hardly a disinterested observer. However, this is one of those visionary texts which is worth reading for its own merits, irrespective of whether it is genuine or not. Taken at face value, the Barddas remains a fascinating text. It has resonances with the Upanishads, Kabbalah, and Freemasonry. The Bardic alphabet presented in the symbol section is completely invented, based on runic and Ogham, and has utility as a magical alphabet. However, it is about as genuine as the alphabets of J.R.R. Tolkien. The Theology section appears to be based on Iolo's peculiar Christian views. He described himself as a Unitarian Quaker. Theology also contains a great number of triads, some of which may be from authentic ancient bardic lore. The wisdom section has a great deal of mythopoetic information, some of which is authentic, some not. The Barddas is great reading if you're at all interested in the ancient Druids, as long as you keep in mind the background of its creation. And then we have a Wikipedia quote about John Williams. John Williams, Bardic name Ab Ithel, 1811, August 27th, born 1862. So he's born 1811, dies 1862. Was an antiquary and Anglican priest. Born in Llangynnefel, Denbighshire, Wales, in 1811, he graduated from Jesus College, Oxford, in 1835 to become the Anglican curate of Llangffor, Merionethshire, where he married Elizabeth Lloyd Williams. In 1843, he became perpetual curate of Nairquist, Flintshire, and rector of Llanynimedry, Merionethshire, in 1849. For much of his early life, he adopted the pseudonym Cynavel after his birthplace in Llangynnefel. However, took the pseudonym Ab Ithel from the surname of his grandfather, William Bethel. His first book, entitled The Church of England, Independent of the Church of Rome in All Ages, concerned the relationship between the Church of England and Rome. This book was published in 1836. It was followed by another in 1844 on the ecclesiastical antiquities of Wales, entitled Ecclesiastical Antiquities of the Cymry and the Ancient British Church. In 1856, Archdeacon Williams produced Rules of Welsh Poetry and Medical Practice of Rhinwallian, and his sons with the Welsh Manuscript Society. By 1860, he had two more pieces of work ready for publication. Chronicle of the Princes and Annales Cambriae were both published in Rolls series. Williams was industrious both as a parish priest and as an antiquary. He was regarded by many of his contemporaries as one of the leading Welsh scholars of his day, and was able to exert a considerable and decidedly mixed influence on the course of Welsh scholarship. Nonetheless, his enthusiasm and Welsh nationalist fervour caused some to criticise him of being uncritical in his approach to the historical record, and strongly influenced by Edward Williams, Iolo Morganwg. I think that means Iolo Morganwg had a societal name, Edward Williams. I'm assuming that by chance they both have the same surname. Okay, so we have a priest in the British Church who deems the British Church to be ancient, which is very much like William Blake, who's a scholar, and he's passing down the information that the bard Iolo Morganwg was transmitting to him. This is a short, I'm just going to read you pieces that I've underlined from John Williams, I assume, his introduction. We're only going to do tiny sections from this, and I'll give you my summary of the thing. The remains of that sublime learning as it existed in the Isle of Britain anterior to Christianity, such as those extracts from about the elements, the migration of the soul from the point of extreme evil in Anan to the point of extreme good in heaven, the mystic name of God, the nature of Cithral, etc., in order to prove the genuineness and great antiquity of these particulars to one who is not initiated in the mysteries of Bardism. It may suffice that they are also discoverable, though in a more corrupt form, in the ancient Bardism of Hindustan. They are old dogmas, at present neither preserved nor existing amidst the antiquities of any nation under the sun, except the Indians and the Cymry. Cymry is the ancient name for the Welsh, or even the Welsh name for the Welsh, I guess. Anan, spelt Annwn, is the Welsh, or it's probably the Middle Welsh or Early Welsh name for where the soul comes from. You could say it's another dimension. I'll put the Wikipedia link for Annan into the description anyway. What else do I want to say about that? I also think of it as like another dimension or something like that. Some people say in the New Age the source or something, where the soul comes from. But I think another dimension is usable for now. Williams goes on to talk about the character of this bard whose information he's presenting. I can't read the Welsh. There is some Welsh here, but let's just go through it and see. Strong feelings indeed he had, amounting almost to prejudice, but they were founded in jealous concern for the due preservation of the traditions of the country, and never displayed, except when he had beheld a disposition to oppugn or disparage what he considered ancient and national. This kind of sensibility comes into a political question of national identity, which I want to make some videos on as well. That he so strenuously advocated the claims of Barddas of Morganwg, or the Glamorgan system of versification, in preference to the 24 new canons of poetry which were sanctioned at the Llamas Eisteddfod, held at Carmarthen under the patronage of Gruffydd ab Nicholas in the 15th century. Secondly, the style is in general too archaic for the 18th century, exhibiting occasionally terms of such an obsolete character as to baffle the skill of the etymologist. So he's talking about the nature of the prose in this book, the Barddas. In reference to a triad entitled Tri Prif Anor Beard Innis Pridon, he remarks, the meaning of this word Anor has not hitherto been satisfactorily given, and proposes the query whether it may not signify an original genius, and soon after whether Anor may not signify a philosopher. So we're dealing with questions of word etymology. It is distinctly stated in other documents that man sprang into existence simultaneously with the resplendent appearance of the triple form of God's name, which was the first manifestation of material light. So you can see echoes of this already in theology, right? The triune God. And the triad is central to Welsh culture. In a minute we're going to look at this other book, which is the Welsh Triads. It's quite a rare book, and again it's the Bardic information coming down the centuries. Is there anything else to say? Let's keep going. Whilst the general subject is the same, there is a want of uniformity in some of the details, as in the directions given for constructing a peltinen, and the formation of a gorsedd, the explanation of the divine epithet I-A-U. So this also connects to Kabbalah and the Jewish tradition, because we have the tetragrammaton, the divine name of God, in that tradition, and in the Welsh tradition, or let's say British tradition, we also have similar enumerations. And the enumeration and names of the elements, this circumstance, whilst it indicates a variety of sources whence the different expressions of opinion must have been derived, at the same time excludes the idea of a collusion. It's a rather obscure statement about the naming of God. To accuse them of being under the influence of that spirit which led to the overthrow of the monarchy and to the establishment of the Commonwealth on its ruins merely because their system represents 3 orders of Bard, Druid, and Overt as co-equal in rank and privilege is, to say the least, not warranted by facts. History does not point out a single bard of those times as mixing in any political intrigue. On the contrary, they, one and all of whom we have any knowledge, appear to have led quiet lives, paying due and just homage of loyalty to the existing government of the day without opposition and without complaint. He's talking of the interspersal in politics and the Bardic line not, in his view, not having an influence on politics. I will make a political statement here. I think that the British monarchy is an aberrant monarchy. What it has done, if we go back to the conspiracy theory that I've already talked about, it's hijacked the true. If there was a monarchic line, then what it's done is, it's, as I said with symbology, it's done the same with the lineage. So they've actually hijacked, they've hacked essentially the racial Bardic line and imposed their own order. And this is going back thousands of years, at least to the time that Yeats talks about Tara being the central city of ancient Ireland. So I don't know how much you'd want to research Druidic ceremony now. I know we have Druidic groups in England. To what extent they've been co-opted, I don't know, because I'm a bit skeptical of the New Age. But there are groups out there. I know there's a group of Cathars in Britain. A lot of this stuff happens near Glastonbury, so I'm often interested in what significance Glastonbury has. I think there is some spiritual, geographical significance. There's just something, there's a vibe in that area. So, yes, there's a claim here that the person writing the preface doesn't agree with, that they are simply just benign sage figures, the bards, and that they don't involve themselves in politics. I don't know, but I would suggest, I've given you my version. I think the monarchy, I would kind of lump the monarchy in with kind of Ikean conspiracy theory. There are reasons why they're there, and there are reasons why they will go eventually. And they have nothing to do with any true monarchy. In fact, I wanted to write an article about that, because I noticed that Bardism connects up with British nationalism to some degree, which is a very dangerous term these days. You're castigated as a racist just for talking about British nationalism. But anyway, I think that there's an issue here that could be delineated a little bit more clearly, which is that if the monarchic line that we know of in Britain and obviously throughout the world is false, and if there is a lineage that could be adopted, would we, in the absence of this false monarchic line, instigate our own monarchic line based on research? I think that's a big ask, because we have a brainwashed populace in England, and some of them quite like the monarchy. It's worth an article, that one. Is there any form of monarchy, that even a well-researched monarchy based on an ancient lineage that could be proved to the masses to be the legitimate line, could they be installed? I don't know. If you've been paying attention to all of the talk of conspiracy surrounding the monarchy going into hiding recently, then there's one main guy who has been suggesting himself as the true monarch. I don't know how that's going to work out. I kind of try to pay attention to any things that are trending in that world. I have nothing to say about it. He has some interesting things to say, but I think it just begs the question more widely. You don't have to agree with him, but it begs the question more widely. Is there any monarchic line that we would like? Could we even imagine a benign monarchic line that would have a useful function in British society or any society? Okay, so that's that question, and that plugs into the Druids as well. I mean, the problem is you've got to dissect it so that you've got the New Age woo-woo kind of out the way, and you do have some kind of legitimate scholars who are looking into this area. You know, we're so diverted onto other questions that there's a whole area of research that nobody's even looked into. All of the problems between England and Ireland, I would say, or at least the majority of the problems, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 years ago, are to do with the hacking of that line. Now, where you make statements on where that hack occurs is up to you. It's up to your scholarship if you're willing to look into it. There's one other issue about, you know, there was another, someone else said, you know, the ex-comedian Tony Robinson has a video about finding the true monarch of England, and there's another person suggested. It's on YouTube. What we know about the ancient version of the Bardic line comes out of Julius Caesar's. It's usually translated. The book is usually translated either as the Gallic Wars or Conquest of the Gauls. It is necessary that we should at the outset bear in mind the following observation made by Caesar as to the comparative merits of the continental and British systems. The institution is thought to have originated in Britain and to have been thence introduced into Gaul, and even now those who wish to become more accurately acquainted with it generally repair thither for the sake of learning it. It is clear from this statement that Druidism in Caesar's time was not considered as pure and as well understood on the continent as it was in the British Isles, its genuine home. Actually, he says the singular there, the British Isle, which is interesting. Its genuine home, and hypothesis, moreover, exactly in accordance with the traditions of the bards. Bardism originated in the Isle of Britain. No other country ever obtained a proper comprehension of Bardism. 3 nations corrupted what they had learned of the Bardism of the Isle of Britain, blending it with heterogeneous principles, by which means they lost it. The Irish, the Cymry of Armorica, and the Germans. Now, Armorica is a tricky one. That may... I don't want to give you a definition that's incorrect there. But what I do think is interesting about this paragraph is that contrary to what I said about global shamanism, there isn't a corollary Bardism, okay, at least according to this book. I'm not so sure about that. Depends on how you define what this is. If it's simply a racial lineage, okay, then and a sense of nationalism, then I would agree with it. If it's more to do with the process of visionary experience, well, I would say that that's common all over the world, so you don't want to confuse those two. So be careful of this definition. I'm not giving you an ultimate definition. I'm just giving you what this book says right now. And also there's a unitary sense of the British Isle, which, like I said, interests me as well. So they call it a system or a school of Bardism. They would not have their tenets published, and because they would not have those who earn them by trusting to letters neglect the exercise of memory, because, just another bit of commentary here, as with Artaud, they were against text because it inhibited memory. So that would be, if you want to go the more extreme route, that's why we don't know much about Bardism, because they rejected the use of textual apparatus. Because they would not have those who learn them by trusting to letters neglect the exercise of memory, since it generally happens that owing to the safeguard of letters, they relax their diligence in learning as well as their memory. In particular, they wish to inculcate this idea that souls do not die, but pass after death from one body to another, and they think that by this means men are very much instigated to the exercise of bravery, the fear of death being despised. They also dispute largely concerning the stars and their motion, the magnitude of the world and the earth, the nature of things, the force and power of the immortal gods, and instruct the youth in their principles. I mean, that's a very important paragraph for me, because I personally agree with all of that, it's actually useful that we have these new cosmologies like Flat Earth coming up, because we don't know what the oral tradition of our own country knew about the ancient world. As I said in my previous video, we have, in vague terms, something like 10 to 20% of all the ancient texts of the Greek and Latin published and translated in the modern times. So even with the existent texts, we still don't know the aims and beliefs of the people of those times. And these people are even more extreme, because they don't even believe in retaining text, because it destroys memory, right? So, there's a vast tradition there that we're unable to participate in modern times. And also, it's a good reminder not to have too many books, which is not my situation. I do remember the philosopher John Moriarty. He's a mystic, Irish mystic philosopher, someone I really like. And there's a wonderful video of him standing in his room in County Kerry, I think it is, looking out at the great mountain there. And he's a bit like me. He doesn't even have bookshelves. I won't turn the camera because it will destroy everything. But he's got all these books sat on the floor, and he looks out the window and he says, "I think these," and he points to the books and he says, "I think these are distracting me from what's outside." It's kind of this sense of like the oral and the what you can get out of the land is way beyond anything you can read about. And it's a fascinating insight, and yes, it's a good reminder that this is only a tiny element of the overall learning. In fact, I'm slowly getting into that more and more with kind of like meditation and stuff. So anyway, the ancient version of the bards were as Artaud was. They didn't like texts. The whole nation of the Gauls is very much given to religious... Oh, this is Caesar. Sorry, this is Caesar observing the Gauls. He's not observing the British bards. This is just a distant indication of a tradition that Caesar's... It's very famous, actually, if you've studied, barbarian cultures. These quotes from Caesar are quite well known. The whole nation of the Gauls is very much given to religious observances, and on that account those who are afflicted with grievous diseases, and those who are engaged in battles and perils, either immolate men as sacrifices, or vow that they will immolate themselves, and they employ the Druids as masters of those sacrifices, because they think that if the life of man is not given for the life of man, the immortal gods cannot be appeased. They have also instituted public sacrifices of the same kind. Some have images of immense size, the limbs of which, interwoven with twigs, they fill with living men, and the same being set on fire. The men, surrounded by the flames, are put to death. They think that the punishment of those who are caught in theft or pillage, or any other wicked act, is more acceptable to the immortal gods. But when there is a deficiency of such evildoers, they have recourse even to the punishment of the innocent. So that's Caesar's take, and it's very much the Wicker Man territory, if you've seen that movie. I have some big problems with the Wicker Man, and there's a remake out there which I probably wouldn't bother recommending. But I still think, like the Greek tradition, Caesar is dealing with a tradition that's also in its latter stages, so that the appeasement of the gods, say, even in Homer it's the same, is one aspect of them, and they are giving sacrifice because they have lost connection with the spiritual realm, and that is emblematized to a great degree in the Bible also. I would say the biblical fall is essentially the same as the problem that these Druids are dealing with here. They have lost the connection to the divine, and sacrifice is becoming more prevalent in order to appease the gods, even in matters of social situations where nobody needs to be punished. Which is interesting in the sense that, say, for example, you take authoritarianism in the modern world, like fascism or Nazism. They gain a lot of followers, possibly for good reasons. I'm not agreeing with any of the outcomes, and don't know enough about the outcomes in order so as to comment. But I think the traditional and the nationalist comes out of the divine and this severed connection with the divine, and so it really can't be gotten over by any form of liberalism, whether it be classical liberalism or neoliberalism as we know it now, or communism. I would say neoliberalism is communism to a great degree now, but we've got a dollop of technocracy thrown in as well. That is not to pin myself down on any political map, but what I am saying is that the severance of the connection with the gods, good or bad, there are good gods and bad gods. You see, what's happening is both sides, they're behaving, like I said in my previous video, the gods are behaving badly in order to gain the attention of the humans who are losing perception of them, and the humans are behaving badly and sacrificing people because that was their way in the old days to do that, and the perception, the conception of the human body and the capacity of the human mind is changing now. Whether that's for good or ill, I would say it's probably for ill, but maybe it's an intentional ill in order for us to learn other lessons, as Rudolf Steiner has, I think, pointed out at some point. So that can go one of two ways. You can say with Caesar that they're just horrible people who just like killing each other for the sake of the gods. But you could look at it in a more nuanced way and say there's a metaphysical problem here. Can we grasp what it means? Can we imagine an earlier time whereby the connection was strong with the divine? Those beings existed. They do exist now. They're all around me as I speak. I'm absolutely convinced. Not all around me. I don't know. I can't count. But what I'm saying is that faculty has disappeared. So the prosaic sense of the world has been installed in some sense, in some way, and we see this all the time manifest. Even in poets of the 14th, 15th, 16th century, we still talk about the muse. We still have folklore. So there's lots of ways that we can still try to inhabit that sensibility. In fact, it's worth mentioning at this point The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes plugs directly into this problem of the Druids behaving badly in Britain, and of course his great example in that book, which I highly recommend, and I'm going to talk about it more in my 5 big inspiring books or something like that kind, is that what was I saying? Yeah, there's definitely something lost there. There's the divine connection lost. I refer to it in my poetry myself as the tethered ones. The tethered ones means that they, before this cataclysm, this schism, this psychic schism that occurred between gods and men, a tether, the function of the word tether just means those people who still had the connection to the divine realm, and we that don't now, and will do again, hopefully soon. I think that's what the biblical apocalypse is actually all about, and that's why we're seeing all these shenanigans in the material world, because the naysayers and the controllers, the archons, don't want this connection to further itself, and I think the internet possibly is helping that. We have a very archaic sense of visionary experience, so that we don't always consider that technology in some form may actually assist us in this connection. And Ezra Pound famously, through his work, I can't remember exactly where, he wrote that great poem called The Return, which is "See, they return." He's talking about the gods returning. And then, of course, he qualifies that later on in the cantos when he says, they won't return, they haven't gone away. So there's this sense of like, he's just adjusting his attitude, because they return assumes that we lost the faculties, and we're going to regain them. But the adjustment assumes that the faculties were always there, and that we're just not, they're not functioning within us. And if the faculties were always there, then the gods were always there. Thus, no need for a return. They are here. Okay, so some other elements of this book which I'd like to look at. There's a lot of talk about alphabet, and again with the Kabbalah. Now, I'm not fixed on a position with the Kabbalah, but the Kabbalah has a sense of there's a word for this. I forget it. Anyway, every symbol has a symbolic meaning, so that you can gematria, is it the counting of letters is symbolic, so that you have a divine mathematics. You have the alphabet we have not explored, almost not at all. We look at the alphabet on a logical level, and what we actually have is a symbolic system, which is imbued with quality over quantity. Okay, so that mathematics has a symbolic value and is related to alphabets. Now, where you want to go take that back to is up to you, depends on where you research word etymology. Robert Duncan seems to hint towards this element of things when he talks about something called language mysticism. So anyway, let's have a look at the Bardic sense of alphabets. The first 10 letters were derived from the creative name of God, and we only have a symbol for that, but it's essentially almost like the Sega symbol, if anybody knows the early game systems, right? It's two lines like going this way and one down the center. Again, it's the triune God put into a symbol, and represented A, B, C, E, T, E, E, L, R, O, S. So the initial letters of the alphabet are not the alphabet that we have now, at least in the English language. They're kind of spread across the alphabet, the 10. And the 10 also, if you know your Kabbalah, you know that's the 10 Sephiroth in the Kabbalah, so that's an interesting connection. So let me just read that again. I won't go through the letters. The first 10 letters were derived from the created name of God and represented and you get the letters. And they had been a secret from the age of ages among the bards of the Isle of Britain for the preservation of memorials of country and nation. Beli the Great made them into 16 and divulged that arrangement, and appointed that they should never after be a concealment of the sciences of letters in respect of the arrangement which he made, but he left the 10 cuttings a secret. Okay, that needs a bit of unpacking as well. Beli, B-E-L-I, again, this is my personal viewpoint, and it's in my poetry somewhere. You had the god Bel. He's in the Bible, actually. He becomes Baal, right? So again, this is the takedown of a god. You see, now what they do is they take down the BBC, but that's our god, or it's a possible god. But in the ancient world, they took down your communal god, right? So you generate a god out of, there's a communion between human and divine. Bel or Beli in this is spelt in this case is that communal god for those Druids and bards of that period, and later become, this is my argument, later becomes Baal. Now Baal is more to do with the nefarious doings of certain archons, etc. But I think it was beneficent originally. That is why you get the Old Testament God coming in and saying, we got to clamp down. If you look in Kings 1, is it Kings 1, Kings 2 in the Old Testament, you get all this stuff. You know, the God is basically saying, we've got to get rid of all these local gods. They're really playing havoc, right? Okay, so that's the alphabet. Beli the Great made them into 16. Okay, so there's some adjustments to the divine form of the alphabet. And he appointed that there should never have to be a concealment of the sciences of letters. But he left the 10 cuttings a secret. Interesting. How beneficent is Beli at this point in history? That's the other thing, is like initially these things spring up and they're wonderful, and then they get degraded. Depends on how you view those first initial 10 letters as the divine letters coming out of the 3. When I get into my tarot readings on video, perhaps we'll get more into the mathematics of the thing. I'll just read a little bit more from the introduction, and then we'll just do some random excerpts. The views of the Gaulish Druids, as far as they expressed by Caesar, do not appear to differ from the above. They wish to inculcate this idea that souls do not die, he's repeating it, but pass after death from one body to another. The only thing that may be supposed to be different is the passing from one body to another, which in the original Latin seems as if it meant from one human body to another human body. And he quotes the Latin ab alils ad alos, which could be very bad Latin, because this is a very corrupt, it's got all these little lines across it, it's a corrupt printing. But in reality there is no inconsistency between the two systems, even in this respect. For though the soul of a good man was considered in general as entering an angelic body in the circle of Gwynedd, and the soul of a wicked man as entering the body of a beast, a reptile, or a bird in Abred, yet it was thought that occasionally the good soul returned from Gwynedd to inhabit a human body, and that the soul of one punished by death against his will for an injurious will passed to another human body. There is no doubt that this, with the Cymry as well as with the Gauls, acted as a strong incentive to bravery, especially as they considered that to suffer in behalf of a truth and justice was one of the greatest virtues, and was sure to bring the soul to everlasting bliss. Again, a lot to talk about there. Aristotle later on, and this is something of a tangent, he has that hierarchy of souls, right? So that you can begin as a gnat or a mosquito, and you'll end up as a rishi or a sage on a mountaintop, very wise and very knowledgeable in the human form. So there's a hierarchy there. It's complicated a little bit in this bardic system, depending on how the person dies. I'm not sure how much I want to go into that. This could also disturb the problem that a lot of people who like Castaneda seem to be into, which is, Castaneda's, his instructor in one of the early books talks about inhabiting the body of a bird, and we get this all through history as well, and apparently it's in the new Colasso book, called The Celestial Hunter, the way that transmigration occurs. There are some societal rules amongst the Druidic schools that assume certain things should be done and certain things shouldn't, which also assumes that they had the power to do it should they so wish, which means they're, just by that fact, a culture of shamanic practice. I would say, generally speaking, Aristotle's got it right in this case, so that the human form is divine and the other forms are lower. Does that inhibit anybody able to transmigrate into other forms? I don't know. I think it's actually in, what was that popular series recently, TV series? You know, shamans transmigrating into animals in order to see what's going on in another. It's kind of almost remote viewing, if you know about that. I don't know. There could actually be codes and practices about that if you actually study this stuff. I don't have any opinions on it right now, but it's interesting to consider. I'm going to just talk about the other rules that they have for transmigration. The Bardic dogma on this head was that the soul commenced its course in the lowest water animalcule and passed at death to other bodies of a superior order successively. So that kind of answers the question I was talking about. And in regular gradation until it entered that of a man. Humanity is a state of liberty where man can attach himself to either good or evil as he pleases. If his good qualities preponderate over his evil qualities, at the time of his death, his soul passes into Gwynedd, or a state of bliss. It's a little bit like the Bardo, possibly, in Tibetan tradition, where good necessarily prevails and from whence it is impossible to fail. But if his evil qualities predominate, his soul descends in abrid into an animal corresponding in character to the disposition he exhibited just before he died. It will then rise as before until it again arrives at the point of liberty, where it will have another chance of clinging to the good. But if it fails, it must fail again, and this may happen for ages and ages, until at last its attachment to good preponderates. It was believed, however, that man could not be guilty twice of the same sin. His experience in abrid, whilst undergoing punishment for any particular sin, would prevent him from loving that sin a second time. Hence the adage, nid in I annen und anneth. I'm guessing that clarifies something. I don't speak Welsh, but yes, so it's a little bit more complicated than the Aristotle, or at least my sense of the Aristotle hierarchy. You don't automatically get to be human at a certain... It's like a school, right? So if you make a few fuck-ups, then you end up back as a cat or something, and then, you know, eventually you predominantly end up being the human form if you don't make too many errors, which seems to be a very dynamic way of interpreting the Aristotelian notion. I think, by the way, if you want to look into that, that's in De Anima, I think, if I remember correctly, Aristotle's version of this stuff. Astronomy. They dispute, this is Caesar again, but there's some commentary on Caesar. They dispute largely concerning the stars and their motion, says Caesar, and herein the Druids of Gaul were similar to those of Britain. We have evidence enough to prove that the latter paid particular attention to the doctrine of the stars. Testimony is borne to their knowledge of the revolution of the stars, even by the very word, which they used to denote time. Amser, compounded of am, round, and ser, the stars. It's interesting because ser, ser, is also in the Italian verb to sit, sedersi. The stars. They themselves also not infrequently went by the name of Siwedidion, that is, astronomers or men versed in the science of the stars. Okay, there's not much to comment on there apart from I want to do some talks on astronomy. My problem at the moment with tarot is that I've kind of discovered that the tropical system, which is the Western system of astrology, doesn't always equate with the Vedic system, and I need to study that, and I can relay the information if I have any, if I have any things that come up out of that. My one instinctive skepticism about this is that in the ancient world there was no astrology, so there's a question hanging over this stuff. Not only do you have two systems of astrology in the modern world, what you call sidereal or Vedic, and Western or tropical, which could be combined. I mean, there are people on the internet talking about combining them. It's not too much of an issue. But you do have a sense of astrology. In the ancient world, it seems, or at least within the Druidic schools and the Bardic schools, they didn't. And my instinct tells me that astronomy is the thing to go for. I mean, just personally, I don't know if that's true for everybody. So that if you're doing tarot or you're doing any horoscopes, it should be based on a whole form of astronomy, which would include our modern sense of astrology, rather than have astrology informing astronomy. I don't know if anybody could ever tell me why these two disciplines split off from each other. I'd love to know. It's very interesting. 10. Cosmology. The bards believed that all the visible creation sprang into existence simultaneously with the pronunciation of God's name, and this article occupies a very prominent place in their religious creed. Yeah, and that's esoteric Christianity, isn't it? And Kabbalah. Forget the Big Bang. That this is the real notion. Having said that, certain theosophical schools worry that because St. John's logos idea is also contravened by a much longer historical line. It may not worry it. Do you understand me? It may be that St. John's pronouncement in St. John's Gospel is just a re-echoing of the earlier idea across vast stages of historical time, prehistorical time, well before the Christian tradition becomes apparent. Don't know. Blavatsky would talk about the stanzas of Zan and everything. That's possible. They could be connected, and that's reaffirmed in Hindu tradition. In fact, I would say, if you're a Brit and you're interested in British tradition and Western esoteric tradition, and this kind of book tickles your fancy, it does seem to me, the more I read from this, is that other traditions of Europe shouldn't really be your first port of call. I see the ancient traditions of Hinduism as much closer to British Bardism than, say, the Latin tradition. I'm not saying don't study Greek and Latin, but I think in terms of magic and cosmology, you're going to want to go back. And you've got to remember that the Vedas are much older. They're much older. So if you're just going for age and wanting to get to the earliest material, you're going to end up in Hindu tradition or the Mahabharata or the Vedas or whatever. I do think there's loads of instances of that. I mean, you only have to look at things that Sinead O'Connor writes as an Irish songwriter to see that there are correlations between Hindu mythology as well. So there's definitely something going on simpatico between those two traditions. As an old poet observes, Pluto, Proserpine, Ceres, Venus, Cupid, Triton, Nereus, Tethys, and Neptune, Hermes, Vulcan, Pan, Jupiter, Juno, Diana, and Apollo are one god. The same doctrine is also taught in the hymns, which historians ascribe to Orpheus. It is quite probable, therefore, that Caesar, when he observed the several parts of the Gaulish worship, concluded that they were adorations offered to distinct gods, and that those gods were similar to the gods of Rome and Greece, with whom with whom he was best acquainted. Now this is fascinating because, again, even I hinted at it in a vague way with that either or mentality. The Latin mentality is just dealing with gods plural, and the ancient British version of that is don't negate one way of looking at the gods. You don't negate the one god for the many, you have both, okay? Again, to repeat, all the names of these people are one god. So you've got the one god, the source. I would say it even comes in the Tao, in Asian tradition. So you got the one god, and then you got the many gods, and then you got the humans, right? And the gods and the humans have an interaction which is disturbed at some point, as I've already explained, so that there's no communication going on between. Well, there is, but it's not in vocalized language anymore. I would say there's still a psychic connection. That's actually what's happening. Everything in manifestation right now is a consequence of these gods existing and informing humans, whether it be on the level of the astral plane or in dreams or different conceptions of the other world. It's all going on. It's just that it's not explicit to us as we go through this life, or at least not for the many of us. I did have something else I wanted to say about that. No, I mean, well, I don't know. All I can say is, yes, you don't exclude different schools here. Yeah, there was one thing. Dylan Thomas. Now, go ahead, spend your next week reading Dylan Thomas poems and tell me that person he's not just talking about pagan gods, plural. The one God is all over Dylan Thomas. In fact, if you read, is it worth me reading the preface? I mean, it is Welsh tradition, right? So why not quote Dylan or Dullan? The prologue in verse written for this collected edition of my poems is intended as an address to my readers, the strangers. This book contains most of the poems I have written and all up to the present year that I wish to preserve. Some of them I have revised a little, but if I went on revising everything that I now do not like in this book, I should be so busy that I would have no time to try to write new poems. I read somewhere of a shepherd who, when asked why he made from within fairy rings ritual observances to the moon to protect his flocks, replied, "I'd be a damn fool if I didn't." These poems, with all their crudities, doubts and confusions, are written for the love of man and in praise of God, and I'd be a damn fool if they weren't. So there you go. I mean, it's pretty concise. Again, he's acknowledging the plural God, gods, and he's also acknowledging the one God in praise of God. I read somewhere of a shepherd who, when asked why he made from within fairy rings ritual observances to the moon. Yeah, because in ancient times the moon was a god, a goddess, a god. And that comes into Celtic tradition. There's lots of names for it. Anyway, it's interesting. So you've got the one God and the many, and they don't exclude each other. Okay, let's go into some of this. This is important to know because I think the other thing that you have with that word monarch, you may already have noticed in my usage of it. You've got archon in the Greek, right? And then you've got mon, the mon, which is one. So it's the one God come down into the human form. It's the divine right of kings in our vaguely medieval into the modern period, right? But let's have a look at this because it does affect the ancient Druidic Bardic sensibility as well. We know not whether Mercury was a name which the Druids themselves gave to their president or their god, or whether it was one that Caesar invented from noticing the similarity that existed between their views and worship and those of his own countrymen. If it be a Celtic name, what does it mean? Is it Mercir, woman, man. That's spelled MERCH WR, Mercia, because the Gwydion looks straight before him alone. The line of the east, Dwyrain, which is spelled DWYRAIN, i.e. rain, the two rays, the ray of Els and the ray of Elvic, which in nature represented the two sexes, male and female. Or is it Markir horseman, because he mounted, or as it were, rode the Mencray, whilst he presided in Gorsedd. Gorsedd is the other realm, the other side. The word march again being originally derived from my arc, i.e. the arc, men arc, being another name of the stone on which the bard stood. Okay, so we've got a load of, we're juggling lots of etymologies here. We've got the one mon, as I've said, but we've also got men, M-A-E-N, and the arc. So the bard stands on the stone, and this links in with the stone of Scone in modern times. In Bardic tradition and Druid tradition, the monarch, if he wishes to proclaim himself a monarch over the realm, then he must do it from a stone. So there's a lot of angles coming in here. All of the divine right of kings is just a re-echoing of a much older sense of the elect who came out of the Bardic schools. After him they worship Apollo, who is supposed to ward off all diseases. He is the same undoubtedly with the sun in the Bardism of the Cymry, which was regarded as the natural or physical representative of the Sun of Righteousness, or the Supreme God. Yes, interesting. So you've got the sun, the worship of the sun, the one God, which comes down in Akhenaten, even in Egyptian theology. And you've got the elect standing on the stone, or being with, is it standing on the stone? But I do think you get that word monarch from this. It doesn't explicitly say it here. When I say monarch, I mean a person who's running a country or a realm. And then you've got the worship of the sun. Now I have a suspicion that this is going to be wild fringe theory. There's a few videos out there, I've had a look at them. The sun is not real in the sense that we have the sun right now. I think the sun, if flat earth cosmology or a section of it, part of it, is a viable option for you to consider, the sun that is projected onto the firmament is the true sun, or at least something that these people are referring to in ancient times. I wonder if the sun that rises and sets supposedly, or at least revolves over the earth according to flat earth theory, I wonder if it's even genuine, or not genuine, it's genuine enough for people to consider it the life-giving force. But what else was I going to say? I'm not sure that it's the sun that these people are talking about. It's an idea, it might go nowhere, but you know, I keep a lot of these things on the back burner because you never know when they might be useful. The Druids of Gaul, according to Caesar, were of opinion that it was this goddess, he's talking about Minerva now. Well, the whole of this part is just the discussion of the pantheon of gods and the way that the Druids perceived them. So, sorry, I'll repeat that. Minerva, the Druids of Gaul, according to Caesar, were of opinion that it was this goddess who instructed them in the principles of works and arts. It is very likely that she was the same originally with the Awen, which is the three stroke, two like that, and one down the middle. The word of God that proceeded out of his mouth, even as Minerva is said to have sprung out of the brain of Jupiter. So you can see how the traditions become interchangeable, the Greek and the British. It was from the Awen that all knowledge was derived. In like manner, Minerva was considered as the goddess of wisdom. One of the objects of Awen is to produce peace Minerva is to produce peace. Minerva produced the olive, the symbol of peace. Where have you heard olive before? Come on, it's all over the Christian tradition as well. So let's repeat that for the sake of clarity. One of the objects of Awan is to produce peace. Minerva produced the olive, the symbol of peace. In several other respects also, a remarkable similarity between the characteristics of the bardic Awan and the goddess Minerva may be pointed out, though in matters of detail this is not necessary, because Caesar observes that the opinion of the Gauls was but almost the same as that of the other nations concerning the above divinities. Whence didst thou proceed, and what is thy beginning? I came from the great world, having my beginning in Anan. Anan is spelled A-N-N-W-N. There is different as with a lot of this stuff, different spellings come down to us, but I think that's the main one. I will definitely put that link in the description. A-N-N-W-N. Okay, so this is your intro. I'm not going to go, there are sections of other introductions, and they usually come down through Latin scholars just prior to the Anno Domini. Strabo comments in BC 54, the three foundations of Bardism: peace, love, and justice. Diodorus Siculus, BC 44. They practice a strange and incredible rite, for having devoted a man for sacrifice, they strike him with a sword on a part above the diaphragm. The victim having fallen, they augur from his mode of falling, the contortion of his limbs, and the flowing of the blood, what may come to pass, giving credence concerning such things to an ancient and long-standing observance. They did this with humans, and they did it with animals. Remember, this is towards the end of Druidism, so things are occurring. I would say that our modern monarchs are essentially Druids, and they perform some of these horrific acts. I mean, we've already got the PE question, which I mentioned in the previous video, but we do have this kind of augury by blood, and I think what it is it's just an echo of the communion with the god in the very ancient world, even well prior to Homer. In fact, the reason we're so magnetized to Homer, I think, is only because it's an echo. We don't have the mutual interaction between men and gods in Homer's time, or even a few hundred years previous to Homer. Homer is the fragment, it's the leftovers. I would say there were periods when this communion between gods and men existed in a beneficent nature, but now we only know it in a fallen nature, and this is a good example of that. I suggest, I've not reread this for a while, but that's my off-the-cuff remark on that one. The mediation of the Druids. According to the declaration of Diodorus, the common people regarded the Druids as mediators between themselves and the gods, and grounded their competency and fitness for that purpose upon the fact that they were acquainted with the divine nature and used the same language. We have already seen that the Druids of Britain, as well as those of Gaul, studied and taught much respecting the nature and attributes of God. Using the same language seems to imply that the language of divine worship was unchangeable, whatever might be that of the people. And since the acts of the Gorsedd in Britain were to be performed at all times in Cymraeg, we may reasonably infer that it was in the old Celtic tongue Druidism was administered on the continent. There was not much difference between the Cymraeg and the native language of Gaul. Okay, We have a lot of Latin scholars talking about their different, commenting on different forms of Druidry and Bardism. I'm not going to go into them. Let's have a look at some other parts. I'm going to give this another half hour and then we'll call it quits and perhaps do a follow-up video at some point in the future, perhaps something more specific to one area of the Barddas. The 5 ages of letters. The 5 ages of letters, the first was the age of the 3 letters, which above all represented the name of God and goodness, and which were a sign of goodness and truth, and understanding and equity, of whatsoever kind they may be. Other things were exhibited, under the sign of blazonry, in respect of the art of a herald bard. This is the mode in which they numbered 10, according to the 3 letters, namely, and then you've got the symbols. You probably won't be able to pick them out, but closer to the Greek, as you can see, seems to me closer to the Greek and possibly the Russian, but definitely the Greek. Okay, so that's the early letters. I'm just skimming over some of this stuff. It's a big book and it's definitely worth reading, but if you want to get into the ancient alphabets of the Druid stroke bards, then have a look. The symbol of word and speech, that is letter. It is from the symbols that a visible word is formed, and from the words a visible language and visible vocality. Now, isn't that interesting? Visible vocality. This concept of synesthesia fascinates me. I haven't made any videos on it, but my assumption there is that you can see colours and sound has colour, and I think that one of the senses that is going to come back to us, and nowadays is probably going to be punished because we live under a materialist system that doesn't understand talent and mistakes it for disability, could possibly be a synesthetic predisposition, which means you can actually see sounds, or sounds create visible changes in your field of vision. I mean, there's even corollaries to Chinese here if you look at this. I mean, I've studied Japanese and I've studied Chinese, you know, in a random way now and again. There are 3 series of Kolbrin symbols, namely the symbols of language and speech, being 24 symbols, the symbols of music and harmony, of which there are 7, namely A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and they are called the symbols of tone and the tones of music, and the 5 symbols of time, namely, and then you get these figures here. Again, you're not going to be able to pick them up, and I'm not even getting them in the camera, it doesn't matter. If you are a student of Chinese Hanja, the Chinese characters, they're really similar to something like, I can see one that looks almost identical to the Chinese character for person, for man or man, which signify the times of the tones. Where bare tones are exhibited, the times are put over them, but where staves are used, that is, the 4 staves of music, the times are represented on the staves and intervening spaces. Okay, so there's some connections there between tonality and music and written alphabet. Terrible light here. Numerals. Obviously not going to read all that, but it's just interesting for you to see. And kind of it's connected with the Om. Alright, so you've got a bit of alphabet work. Let's see if we've got any other things here. Okay, so Colburn. I'm assuming at this point, because I'm rereading this after a long while, having not looked at it. I'm assuming it's Colburn or Colburn is the alphabet. Is the alphabetical system. After the intestine war of Owen Glyndŵr, the king forbade paper and plug to be brought into Cymru or to be manufactured there, in order that it might prevent epistolary correspondence between a Cymro and a Cymro, and between the Cymri and the people of a bordering country and of foreign lands, and this to revenge the siding with Owen, which was observed everywhere on the part of every man in Cymru. He also forbade the bards and poets to go their circuits and to visit the different families officially. Strangely modern in our lockdown-ish times. Yeah, this is why I'm a little skeptical of the extreme position of no text whatsoever. In Russia, as I've already spoke about, they would memorize poems so that they wouldn't be caught with the text. But doesn't it work both ways? Like, I guess the memorized is utterly secret, but that's no good if you don't have extrasensory perception and somebody's speaking some magical poem that will change the whole of the British Isles, and no one else can hear it, and there's no way to transfer that vocalization for someone else to see it hundreds of miles away. So there are pluses and minuses. I mean, I'm a Marshall McLuhan fan, right? So he's always talking about the Gutenberg galaxy, which is all about the spread of knowledge. And you're watching me now, if you're watching me at all, because you can hear my words in your ears, even though I'm possibly thousands of miles away. So yeah, there's a technical progression which is useful. But it seems to me, and it's the same thing with being sociable, isn't it? People always say this now. The internet's wonderful, but it's better if I had the person in the room, right? There's something different. As much as the alphabet contains the vocalization, there's something different about the vocalization being in your ear or even in your sight, because just having that tone in front of you, or that series of tones. God and the faculties of the soul. What is the soul? The breath of God in a carnal body. What is life? The might of God. The fall in Abred. I think Abred, which I'm pronouncing as if it's Russian or something, Abred is the opposite of Anan. Anan is the ideal realm which we've fallen from, and Abred is the material world that we inhabit now. It's a fallen world, or at least if you go through the Bible, you'll connect that up. God made all living beings in the circle of Gwynfyd at one breath, but they would be gods, and attempted to traverse the Soigant. This, however, they could not do before they fell down to Anan, which unites with death and the earth, which is the beginning of all living owners of terrestrial bodies. See, I stand corrected again. So, is Abred the name of the process? It seems to me that there's a hierarchy going on here. Anan also represents a fall. Okay, Abred could be. Is that a corollary to Atman in the Upanishads, which is the overall, all of it? The other words represent stages in a hierarchy of fall. I won't tease that out anymore, but there you go. The creation, worship, vocal song, Gwyddoniad. Why is it called the Gwyddoniad? Well, there you go. I am, at least imaginatively, writing a poem presently, which is all about Oh, well, I don't know do I want to get too much into it? I don't want anyone stealing my fucking ideas. Anyway, I have a hero. He's an Orpheus figure, but he's not Orpheus. He's not in the Greek tradition. A lot of my writing is to do with transferring, let's call it miraculous or magical processes of bardism from one culture into another. So, for example, Greek culture has it has its stuff, and everyone's very well aware of it. But I'd like to exploit the corollaries in the Celtic or Bardic pantheon more. So, anyway, it doesn't need too much explanation. There are people in the Celtic tradition or characters that you can exploit for reasons of your own investigation. Okay, and this doesn't just it's not too dissimilar from, say, if you've read the Hermeticum, the Corpus Hermeticum, or the Kybalion or things like that, where you have these dialogues between an adept and a teacher. That is the weird thing, isn't it? We'll read the Tao, what is it, the Tao Te Ching or something, and we have the same thing going on here. So, master from the hold on a second. Master, from the particles which he collected out of the infinite expanse in the circle of Soigent and collocated in order and just arrangement in the circle of Gwynford as worlds and lives and natures, without number, weight, or measure, which any mind or intellect but himself could possibly foresee or devise, even if it possessed the endless ages of the circle of Soigent. I don't know if I'm pronouncing Soigent right or not. I think it does seem a little bit like the Atman. By what instrumentality or agency did God make these things? By the voice of his mighty energy, that is, by its melodious sweetness, which was scarcely heard when the dead gleamed into life, and the non-entity, which had neither place or existence, flashed like lightning into elementation, and rejoiced into life, and the congealed, motionless shiver warmed into living existence. The destitute nothing rejoiced into being 1,000 times more quickly than the lightning reaches its home. It's just tough reading this because I've got some obstructions. Doesn't that sound like Rudolf Steiner? Some of that, if you read some of the more abstract philosophy. The acolyte responds, "Did any living being hear that melodious voice?" The master says, "Yes, and co-instantaneously with the voice were seen all sciences and all things cognitive, in the imperishable and endless stability of their existence and life. For the first that existed, and the first that lived, the first that obtained knowledge, and the first that knew it, was the first that practiced it, and the first sage was Huon, the son of Nud, who is called Gwyn, the son of Nud, and Eniged the giant. It was he who first made demonstration visible and inceptive to the inferences of men." Okay, I'm going to throw in another thing here, right? Giants. That's a bit much on the internet, isn't it? Again, I kind of learned some of these things through literature to begin with, so they didn't faze me when they started, people start talking about giants and stuff. P.B. Shelley, if I remember rightly, in some of his prose, talks about the giants, or the age of the giants. Okay, let's go on. Who was the first that instituted the worship and adoration of God? The master. Set, the son of Adam, that is, he first made a retreat for worship in the woods of the Vale of Hebron, having first searched and investigated the trees, until he found a large oak, being the king of trees, branching, wide-spreading, thick-topped and shady, under which he formed a choir and a place of worship. This was called Gorsedd, and hence originated the name Gorsedd, which was given to every place of worship, and it was in that choir that Enos, the son of Set, composed a vocal song to God. Who was that the first that made a vocal song? The master replies, Enos, the son of Set, the son of Adam, was the first that made a vocal song and praised God, first in just poetry, and it was in his father's Gorsid that he first obtained Awen, which was Awen from God. Hence has arisen the usage of holding the Gorsid of vocal song in the resort and Gorsid of worship. He's referring to what we would call now the Eisteddfod, maybe, in the Welsh tradition, which is a poetry festival, I think. This is an earlier conception of that. For what honourable purposes did Enos the son of Set invent vocal song? In the first place, for the purpose of praising God and all goodness. Secondly, to commemorate good qualities, incidents, and knowledge. Thirdly, to convey instruction relative to praiseworthy sciences in respect of God and man. That is, in such a way as would be easier to learn and remember, and most pleasant to listen to. What was the name that the wise men first had, whose employment was vocal song and laudable sciences? One was called Gwydion, and many Gwydioniad, and they were so called because they followed their art in woods and under trees, in retired and inaccessible places, for the sake of quietness and the meditation of Awenic learning and sciences from God, and for the sake of quietness to teach the sciences to such as sought them and desired wisdom by means of reason and Awen from God. So if that's not some bardic form of Orphic tradition, then I don't know what is. I mean, it's pretty obvious there. We have calendars. We have different calendars of the year. I know that the Russian calendar was different before the institution of the new calendar in Russia. Tsvetieva used that calendar. And then we have ancient versions of calendars. I'm just going to do a bit more on astronomy and a little bit more on the way they conceived of the calendar, and this would be to include Christ from the biblical tradition as well. The stars. There are three kinds of stars: fixed stars, which keep their places and are also called stationary stars; erratic stars, which are called planets and are 15 in number, 7 being always visible and 8 invisible, except very seldom, because they revolve within and beyond the galaxy. And the third are irregular stars, which are called comets, and nothing is known of their place, number, and time, nor are they themselves known, except on occasions of chance and in the course of ages. Okay, so I'm not massively studied in comets, but we can see how they interpreted. This is interesting. Blake talks about suns and stars that we can see, and some are not visible, so that you've got basically a solar system that is not visible to the human eye and won't be until some form of spiritual science enables the body to perceive the universe, the vastness of space differently. So the two things are going on hand in hand. The development of what is astronomy is going hand in hand with the bodily development of these extra senses that I've already spoken about. So that's kind of an interesting take on it. They're just categorized a little differently to what I've studied before, but there's some connection with Blake there. I'll just read this last piece, I think, and then I've got a few more books I want to just introduce briefly, and then we'll get on our way. Chronology. Before the coming of Christ in the flesh, the bards solemnized times according to the years of memorial and computation, namely from the time of Pridon, the son of Ed the Great, which was famous 566 years before the birth of Christ in the flesh. And from that time it is usual with the bards to celebrate the memorial and computation of time in accordance with the years of Christ. Pridon, the son of Ed the Great, as far as memorial and knowledge go, lived the time mentioned before the birth of Christ, and according to the conjecture of wise men and well-informed herald bards, 650 years subsequently to the first arrival of the Cymry in the island of Britain. It was thus 1,216 years before the death of Christ that the nation of the Cymry first came into the island of Britain, and this was called Brut time, spelling B-R-U-T, because the years of memory and computation were in old times conjecturally reckoned from the time of Brut, B-R-U-T again, which was about 1,000 years after the demolition of the Tower of Nimrod the giant, and about 2,800 years after the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Paradise, which occurred 200 years after God had made this world. It's interesting because there's different interpretations on what the Christian tradition is and what kind of timeline it can work with. We have an Orphic figure that I just spoke about, referring to God, but we also have something else. We have this sense of Britain as one land, politically unified. I guess that would be the big question, given our politics right now. It's kind of interesting. But then we also have the Welsh as the Cymry as a nation within the larger sphere of those isles, the island of Britain. So I wonder how this has been put down by Iolo Morganwg, because those two conceptions of the lands of Britain are different. The brute. It was thus 1,216 years before the birth of Christ that the nation of the Cymry first came into the island of Britain. And this was called Brut time. So each race of people on the isle have their own calendar, essentially. But again, I'm looking at it more from a racial perspective or a tribal perspective. Like the Cymry are not the British, maybe at this point. But then we have other conceptions which include the Celt, which are all Britain. So, I mean, ideally, I would love to have a kind of, just politically speaking, like have this as a unified isle. It's not like this island is similar to the Korean peninsula, but whether that can ever be done, because every form of unification that's come previous in the last 1,000 years has always come with the monarchic, malefic element. If you could tame that and jail them all or something, then possibly you'd have some form of union. But that's just politics. Anyway, a bit of conjecture. I'm going to leave it there. That's the book. I'm sure you can get it online. If there's a PDF version of it, I'll actually link to it in the description. That's going to be the prime text for my discussion of Bardism. If you want to learn more, then have a read of it. I think this talk has rendered up so much commentary in me that it might well be worth coming back to this topic, because it is fascinating. By the way, Ginsberg was cognizant of this book, and he does talk about the bards sometimes. Like I've already said, I'm not a big fan of him, but the beats, it's often said that the beats had a kind of neo-Greek angle to them, in some sense, and then of course the Greek leads into ancient Britain in some sense as well. It was talked about in the 60s, but it's still a fringe book, this, and get your hands on it because it's interesting. What I like about it is that all continental philosophy of the 19th and 20th century, if it is philosophy per se, it tends to be in one realm of thought. This is philosophy, but it also includes astronomy, it includes calendars, it includes fragments of poems, it has history, it has a bunch of different things in here. And if you're a Bible scholar, I would definitely recommend it because you can make connections between what's going on in the ancient world through the Bible and look at the way that these people considered the world. So, Bardism. Before I go, I'm just going to mention a few books. You don't need to follow up on them if you don't want. Robert Graves was already mentioned in my introduction. That's a good read. This is also, I would put under my little category of Bardism. If you don't want to call it Bardism, you could call it Western Esoteric Tradition. That's a very famous book. Everyone has different opinions about Graves's poetry, but I think that is a stalwart book of mythology, philosophy, folklore. Again, the Orphic element to this stuff is very high, and you've got gods and goddesses. Obviously, I'll read I always love the preface to this. In dedication, all saints revile her, and all sober men ruled by the god Apollo's golden mean, in scorn of which I sailed to find her in distant regions likeliest to hold her, whom I desired above all things to know. Sister of the mirage and echo, it was a virtue not to stay, to go my headstrong and heroic way, seeking her out at the volcano's head, among pack ice, or where the track had faded, beyond the cavern of the seven sleepers, whose broad high brow was white as any leper's, whose eyes were blue, with rowan-berry lips, with hair curled, honey-coloured to white hips. Green sap of spring in the young wood astir will celebrate the mountain mother, and every songbird shout a while for her. But I am gifted, even in November, rawest of seasons, with so huge a sense of her nakedly worn magnificence, I forget cruelty and past betrayal, careless of where the next bright bolt may fall. And that's his little frontispiece poem from The White Goddess. All about the muse. A very rare book, which I might have to get into at some point down the line. The Welsh triads. They are literally all 3-line poems, which is a haiku, isn't it? No connection. Yeah, we might get into that at some other point. It's more of a tricky book to get hold of, but it's worth a mention. I think the poet Robert Kelly has looked into it. I don't know many people who have. And the last but not least is this self-published book, which I've only just started, but it's definitely in that tradition. The Poet's Ohm, and this guy's a poet from Belfast, John Paul Patton. I won't be able to talk too much about it because I've just started it, but it's excellent, and it goes into alphabets, spiritual practices, God knows what, loads of stuff, calendars, symbology, Western esotericism, good stuff. Okay, we'll leave it at there. That's Bardism and Bardism against literature. Have a good one.